Welcome to this podcast. My name is Davar Bhatt, and I am the research manager at Legal Aid Society. Um, Legal Aid Society is a non-profit organization that has been working for the past couple of years to bring in policy reforms and suggest legal reforms which will ameliorate conditions for various underprivileged as well as vulnerable groups across the Sindh province. The Legal Aid Society also works on a particular project called the Access to Justice for Religious Minorities in Sindh, Pakistan. Under the project, we have so far produced a legal needs assessment which seeks the viewpoints of various religious communities which reside in the Sindh province, particularly the Christian, Hindu, and Sikh communities. And as a result, we have been able to highlight various needs of the minorities. In a sense, in the recent history and in the past couple of years, one of the major challenges that the Sindh province has repeatedly seen is the issue of forced conversions. There are multiple opinions on this issue, and certain elements say that it is a considerable concern for all religious communities in the province because of the repeated offense. And there are elements who deny it as well as work on the lobbying front to consider hindering any sort of reforms. Today, we will be discussing the forced conversion bill, which a parliamentary committee had created, and it was intended to highlight the issue as well as put in penal penalties and various reforms which may prevent forced conversions or abductions. And joining me is Mr. Peter Jacob, who runs the Center for Social Justice and is also an advisor to the Legal Aid Society for our work with the religious communities in the Sindh province. Mr. Peter Jacob has many decades of experience in research, particularly aimed again at vulnerable communities and religious communities all over Pakistan. He has also been in advisory committees concerning the Christian as well as other minorities across Pakistan and for various legislative development. And to start off this discussion, our very first question for our audience will be that what was in the forced conversion bill and what sort of reform was intended through it. So, Peter Saab, if you can take it from here.
Thank you so much, Dava and Legal Aid Society for calling me in for this discussion on the bill, particularly, but also the issue of forced conversions in Pakistan. Well, media has reported time again, and my own experience as an organization providing legal aid from my earlier forum, which was National Commission for Justice and Peace, and research and advocacy experience of Center for Social Justice. I think it would be merely denial to say that the problem is limited to sin or it's a small problem. I think in the crux of the matter lies the very question of religious freedom at large in Pakistan. Not limited to minorities, it is for the majority as well. And the question of rule of law in Pakistan. See, the most cases that surfaced, for instance, I can tell you that during this year, in the passing year, there have been 42 cases already reported which would fall in the definition of forced conversions. We have a working definition to explain what forced conversions are, and these are mainly where the marriage is compulsory or simultaneously associated with these conversions, where it happens to be a minor female, where the court procedures or the jurisdiction of the courts and police stations is avoided somehow. So on those underage marriages of minor minority girls we consider fit for an investigation under forced convergence. Now, we do not have a legislation that explains what forced conversion is, although there are other clauses that can be relied upon in the meantime regarding abduction, kidnapping, and of course, forced marriage is a crime already. But there is no specific legislation. Hence, there was a call and need. Even the parliamentary committee that was set up in 2019, November, um, was assigned this name. It was called the Parliamentary Committee to Protect Minorities from Forced Convergence. So at that moment, the problem stood recognized. But later on, there are elements in our country, and I would like to be blunt about it. It is religious political parties who were represented already, and an element in the PTI itself, uh, which has very narrow and medieval interpretation of religion, particularly Islam, and they raised objections on this. Now, with regard to the content of the bill, it was basically defining what forced conversion is in the definition part, and then it was placing certain conditions. For instance, one, the age. So one could only convert to a religion and practically speaking to Islam in Pakistan and not to any other religion uh, at the age of 18. Second, it provided a testimony or a cross-checking of information or claim by the magistrate. And finally, there was a contemplation period placed in. So everyone who converted was also, before being testified by the court, was given 90 days of, that contemplation period. Now, these clauses were objected to by some of the political parties, and one could say that a so-called think tank based in Islamabad organized a visit of Mia Mitta, who is a self-proclaimed preacher and claims to have converted thousands of people to Islam, belonging to Barchundi Sharif, a kind of shrine where people go for prayers, etc. But then he was invited to Islamabad and the Council of Islamic Ideology at behest of Ministry of Religious Affairs. So these are the actors who were involved in not only raising a kind of opinion that somehow this bill is anti-Sharia or the norms in Islam. So that is how on 13th of October, the chairman arbitrarily and unilaterally, as you said, without giving the minority members to give their opinion or answer to the questions. There were no questions, but the comments raised by the chairman and members of the cabinet, Ministry of Religious Affairs and Ministry of Parliamentary Affairs, they unilaterally rejected, dismissed the draft bill prepared by Ministry for Human Rights.
Okay, so what I understand is that there is a lobby both within the parliament and actors associated with such people and political parties who have been influential enough to completely sideline voices of the minority groups. So, in this sense, do you feel that maybe Parliament itself, people within the Parliament, especially directly elected voices, should be lobbied with by the communities themselves, or do you think that more legally oriented forums such as the Supreme Court could be approached to assess if the parliamentary committee was following the norms laid down by the law? Because if a parliamentary committee itself does not give voices to its members and the chair unilaterally freezes any sort of proceedings or says that the proceedings no longer will be viable to be conducted. What sort of options do you think you have left to further sort of take the reforms forward?
As long as we are, as a nation, committed to resolving this problem, I think there are several options with regard to appropriate forums. It would be appropriate to seek a court injunction on that, a court ruling on that, because earlier we have precedents, on that. Justice Nasrul Mulk, as when he was Chief Justice of Pakistan, he passed several orders asking government to pass the Hindu marriage bill, for instance. I mean, there was a need, a felt need, and there was evident need as well. Then we have parties consulting the Supreme Court and High Courts on various pieces of legislation under consideration, past legislations. So that would be an option. However, now in this case, we see that one ministry that prepared the bill was not even given a chance to speak on that, to explain why this bill was drafted in that fashion and why certain clauses were made part of it. Now, one institution that I think has no jurisdiction is the Council of Islamic Ideology. Its mandate, explained in the Constitution, does not include any legislation regarding minorities or human rights. Therefore, I think that institution should not be invited. I must tell your audience that while Asma Jahangir conference was going on in Lahore a couple of weeks ago, Qibla Ayaz, who is very dear friend of mine and respected friend, as chairman of a Council of Islamic Ideology, we shared a panel and this issue came under discussion. While he invited me personally, because we have been doing advocacy on this and presenting research, he invited me to come and sit over this. Personally, if you ask me, I would be very reluctant to join a forum or an office where people like Mia Mitta were greeted and they were listened to before the bill was placed before the committee, and not us. I would be very reluctant and shy to go and sit at the same place where people like, Mia Mitta, who is only innocent until investigated. He has been, and he is not the only one. And that's why, you see, I would say that Ministry of Religious Affairs and Council of Islamic Ideology, in this case, of course, having no jurisdiction, but Ministry of Religious Affairs has still to prove its impartiality. It has been partial so far, where the issues, particularly the issue of forced conversions, but many other issues like formation of National Commission for Minorities was totally against the precedent in Pakistan. They formed the commission through a notification, so we call it a toothless commission. Again, but the Ministry of Religious Affairs has no competence. There is no proven record that they have resolved the issues of minorities or they have research-based data on these issues. Therefore, I would be very reluctant to place it before the Ministry of Religious Affairs. Our reliance will be on the Ministry of Human Rights, which is directly concerned and relevant to the issue.
Yes, I would agree with that because it makes sense that since it's primarily a human rights issue and secondarily also a gender issue, and we often ignore this part when we discuss the actual act of forced marriage and forced conversion, that it's mostly girls, and especially mostly underage girls. So, in a sense, our research within the organization and interaction with institutions also suggests that there may be ways to sort of create hindrances to the registration of forced marriages, or, for example, to have enough evidence that a marriage, especially a forced marriage, cannot be registered single handedly. Do you think that maybe institutional reforms within NADRA, or, for example, local government rules, which basically are responsible for marriage registration or divorce and family laws, do you think in the meantime, perhaps Sindh province, which is considered more liberal compared to other regions and more inclusive of all the communities that exist here, do you think that provincially, if the federal government is in a way very, very lax in its approach, do you think Sindh, where it is a big issue, should come forward and try to assess some sort of provincial reforms? And perhaps this is also an area where organizations like ours can contribute more effectively with our on ground presence. What sort of reforms could a provincial government perhaps do in this regard?
As far as Sindh, there are two specific legal remedies that are available only in Sindh. That is one, that where you have this Child Marriage Restraint Act, which which defines the marriageable age to be the majority, which is 18. So a nice way of dealing with problem, although indirectly, forced conversions also, is to strictly implement the law on child marriage restraint. Secondly, this Assembly of Sindh has already done the exercise, although it did not succeed in 2016. They had already passed. It only it failed to receive the assent of the governor at that time. So there is a precedent. There is a legal remedy. Therefore, I would say that the Sindh, as far as protection, legal protection is concerned, is better off. But I think a provincial legislation is but necessary under the 18th Amendment. Even if we have a federal legislation, the provincial legislation would be all the more better. Even the province of Punjab has heard several times Mr. Ijaz Alam Augustin, who is the provincial minister for human rights and minorities affairs in Punjab, saying that they would like to table a bill. I don't know what stage it is at the moment, but I think that you see the need is being felt by the minorities in Punjab as well. So a provincial legislation is all the more better, I must say.
I think that fairly is I think starting point. As starting point, perhaps organizations like ours, under your guidance and the precedents that have been set, perhaps while we have the forced conversion bill also in the National Assembly, perhaps I think it's time that the provinces also step up. And since we see repeated instances in Sindh and Punjab among the federating units, perhaps these are the areas where we can intervene and suggest sort of interventions institutionally, even socially, that society needs to accept that these practices have to be are of course not in tune with the world as it exists today. Certain marriage age issues are again, we have a traditional understanding of what is the marriage age. Perhaps there needs to be now a more civil understanding of it, because young marriages often also result in other issues. It could be cutting down a girl's
Exactly.
education, it could be
Yes.
higher
It's
fertility
a
rates.
complicated health issue.
Exactly, and of course, it has a huge economic impact when a woman who marries early, she will obviously have kids early, and that results her whole adult life, where she could have been an economic actor and also been an active part of the labor force. She does not do it. And of course, Pakistan performs very, very poorly when it comes to women participation in the labor force. And as a result, we also perform very poorly in as a national economy as a whole. So I think these are certain things that government and obviously the society needs to think of it, the bigger pictures. It's a big human rights issue, and it isn't. It the primary effectees at that point might be girls from religious communities, but as a whole, our nation is suffering because of this. Uh, so thank you so much, Peter Saab, for joining us for this podcast. And we hope to keep bringing these issues up, and we will continue this series with further topics which discuss elements of how other religious communities, not just the majority, but all the other religious communities in the country, have various concerns, and how, as a whole nation, we can resolve them. Thank you so much for
Thank you,
joining us.
Dava. Thank you, Dava. Let us continue to wage this struggle together. Thank you so much.